Jack the Ripper, the Whitechapel murderer, the leather apron, the most famous murderer of all time. Hi, I'm Matt Swain, and this is the Unsolved Case of Jack the Ripper. Now, we all have heard of Jack the Ripper. We've all probably heard some stories about him, but most of us don't know too much. So, to start off with, let's just look at what we do know. Well, most people know that Jack the Ripper was a murderer from London in the 1880s. But for most, that's about where the information stops. Some people know more, some people know less, it really just depends. But with these being the only things that most people know, Jack has kind of developed an air of mystery around him, and that has led into Jack becoming more of a mythical creature than an actual man. Now, to understand Jack, we really need to look at where the name Jack the Ripper came from. Now, of course, Jack the Ripper was not the killer's actual name. It was actually a name that started popping up in something that we know as the Ripper letters. Now, these were letters that were written to the Central News Agency during the murders. Now, it was something that a lot of people really got excited about because this was at a time when the printing industry was really getting strong. A lot of people were actually starting to read newspapers, and seeing the name Jack the Ripper as the name for a killer, it really added to the excitement and the mystery surrounding these crimes. And this is seen as kind of the motive of the writer of these letters, because most everybody who has studied the Ripper case have agreed that the letters were not actually written by Jack. They were actually written by a man named Tom Bulling, who was a journalist from the Central News Agency, because he was trying to add to the excitement of the case by writing these letters to his own employer. So, that with the fact that the letters were written after the murders had happened and after people actually knew about the murders, it kind of made it hard to believe that these letters were real. However, there was one that was different. It was a letter that was sent along with a package that was sent to George Lusk, who was the head of a vigilance committee in Whitechapel. And when he opened the package, he found a human kidney and the letter. And the letter says that the kidney that was in the package was removed from the Ripper's latest victim. And although it is not a fact, a complete fact, that Jack actually did send it, it is highly possible that it could have been from Jack, because the kidney had a disease that the victim actually did have, and so the description of the kidney does match up with the victim's disease. So that one actually might have been from Jack. However, it's not completely sure. Now, other than the Ripper letters, which barely count, there wasn't much evidence to be collected from any of the crime scenes of the Ripper murders. Now, this is partly because there wasn't a lot of forensic technology at this point in time, so they couldn't just go and collect some DNA to test. However, it's also because of the Ripper's method of murdering. And that actually has helped us to narrow down the list of suspects. So, the way that he actually killed people was really his genius. Very perverse genius, but genius nonetheless. Because the way that he did it, he made sure that he did not get blood on himself, and he wouldn't be tracking blood anywhere. So the way that he did that is he would grab the women by their throats and strangle them until they're unconscious, if not dead, and then he would set them down on the ground and slit their throat. Now, the reason that he made sure they're at least unconscious before he killed them, or before he slit their throat, was because that way the blood wasn't as pressurized and it didn't just shoot out of their veins and splatter him with blood. And so you kind of have to wonder how much medical knowledge he had, since he knew that much about blood. However, it doesn't absolutely say that he was a doctor or had any medical knowledge whatsoever. He could have just learned a little bit about it. But then what he did next is really what makes it pretty certain that he was a doctor or had some sort of medical knowledge, because he would take a trophy from each of his victims. When I say that he took a trophy, I mean he cut an internal organ out of the victim's body and took it with him. Now, as I said earlier, he might have actually sent the kidney of one of his victims to the man with the Ripper letter. But, of course, we're still not positive that that was him. However, the way that we know that the Ripper was either a doctor or surgeon or had medical knowledge of some sort is because when he took the organ, he didn't damage any of the other internal organs around the one that he was taking. Now, this really makes it seem as if he knew what he was doing, because anyone can take an organ out of someone's body, but to leave everything intact except for that one that he took had to have taken at least some knowledge of the human body. Now, it was really amazing, too, that other than the injuries that he inflicted on purpose to the victims, there was really nothing else. There weren't bruises on the back of the head from when he strangled them, because he gently set them down. He didn't get any of the other internal organs messed up. He didn't damage anything other than the stuff he wanted to damage. And everything that he did had a purpose, pretty much. So when you look through the list of suspects, you can go ahead and discount anyone who wasn't a doctor or a surgeon or had medical knowledge, because there was no way that they could have known that much about the human body so that they could make sure they didn't damage any other part of the body other than what they were trying to damage. So this really narrows down the suspect list a lot, because this was not at a time when most everyone had some sort of medical knowledge. There weren't tons of nurses and doctors. So you can narrow it down a whole lot just from the way that he killed his victims. Now, just like most everything else in the Ripper case, the victims really just add to the whole mystery of the murders, because there's just so much that's unclear about who the victims were or why the Ripper chose them. Now, it's also really unclear how many victims there actually were. it's generally accepted that he only killed 5 people. However, other people have claimed that there were only 4. Some say there were more than 7 victims of the Ripper. And actually, at the time that they were happening, the press and even the police officers thought that the Ripper was responsible for 9 different murders. However, the 5 that most people accept as the Ripper's victims today are Marianne Nichols, who was murdered on August 31st, 1888, Annie Chapman, who was killed September 8th, 1888, Elizabeth Stride, who was killed September 30th, 1888, and Catherine Eddowes, who was killed on the same date as Elizabeth Stride. And then the last one was Mary Jane Kelly, who was killed November 9th, 1888. However, some people claim that the first victim was not actually Marianne Nichols, but was actually Martha Tabman. Though Martha Tabman was killed August 7th, 1888, almost a month before Marianne Nichols. So, there's really no way to tell if she was one of the Ripper victims, because there wasn't really a lot of similarities between all of the victims. Granted, they were all prostitutes, and they were all killed between early August and early November, all in 1888, but they varied in age and appearances, and none of them knew each other. And the only other similarities were they were all killed outdoors, except for Martha Tabman and Mary Jane Kelly, the supposed first and last victims. And they were all either drunk or thought to be drunk when they were killed. But other than that, there's really no way of telling who else could have been a victim.